Warning, the 8,000-year-old digital logic found under the Gobi. Are you sitting down? The ground is clicking. Not wind, not insects. Wet rhythmic clicks like heavy switches flipping under sand. We kill the generator for silence, but the pulse keeps going. Trust me, you're not ready. If what's under these dunes is what it seems, the map of history breaks. We're talking sealed shafts in the Gobi, banned digs, and a field notebook that vanished twice. 8,000 years back, when this desert was green, someone wrote rules in water, and they still tick. This rabbit hole goes deeper. Once you see the logic hiding under the sand, there's no going back. The leak that shouldn't exist. Look, I'm gonna tell you something that sounds insane, but hear me out. The first clue didn't come from a dig or a museum. It came from a cracked customs box on a metal table in Ulaanbaatar in the 1990s. Fossils, beads, and one sun-brittle field notebook stamped miscellaneous. Graph squares, a coffee ring, and on page 7, a tight grid of hexes stitched like honeycomb, with arrows and numbers that looked like a pipeline plan, not an artifact sketch. In the margin, scribbled in Czech and Mongolian, hydraulic gates. At first it felt like a prank. Then the drawing next to it hit like a brick. A clean copy of Nikola Tesla's 1920 patent, the valvular conduit, a one-way channel with no moving parts, a fluidic diode. In the margin, same effect. On the next page, a clipped photo of the MONIAC, the 1949 water computer that modeled whole economies with tanks and colored dye. If fluids can compute, the notebook wasn't about drains. It was about logic. Stakes showed up fast for anyone who touched it. If real, it meant carved gates and timed flows, decisions written in stone. If fake, careers would burn. A young researcher wrote counting channels in a brief and got called a category error. Tenure denied, books boxed. That notebook drifted through hands like contraband. Meanwhile, the paper trail went strange. The seizure report logged the notebook, then it misplaced, then reappeared in a private pouch to a retired hydrologist in Prague who'd spent decades on Soviet irrigation. He recognized Tesla's valve on site, slid in a MONIAC photocopy, and scrawled, "You're not crazy." He also flagged something modern engineers obsess over in networks, equal path lengths. Curiosity loop, why hexes? Hold, that answer arrives only after field timing proof and mineral wear patterns. Hex grids aren't pretty for fun, they keep timing clean. Across town, in a warm cafe with coats steaming by the radiator, 3 tables pushed together, the pages were taped flat. A geophysicist, an ethnographer, a structural engineer. They translated frantic notes, found coordinates, compass roses, and a tiny repeating mark, twin lines, and a dot. The ethnographer touched it and said her grandmother wove that motif after heavy rains. Not proof, but a shiver. They didn't write a paper, they made a pact. A consortium, which was really a handful of stubborn friends. One rule, don't publish until you can verify it in the ground. They chased coordinates into no-go dunes where permits stall and radios die. A herder's nephew who fixed oil trucks drew a route on a napkin to dodge checkpoints. They rented a van, loaded ground-penetrating radar and a bird-counting drone, and drove east. On the way, the engineer worried the same bone. Why hexes? Irrigation loves rectangles, tombs love circles. Hexes show up when you need tight packing and equal paths. Bees, fiber networks clocked routing. If flows arrive late, you know upstream changed. That's diagnostics, not drainage. Withhold the how-to beats, then show the biased pocket test that flips skeptics into subscribers. The notebook gave them a research anchor, Tesla's valvular conduit etched into a maze. Fluidic logic still uses that to bias a branch without parts. 2 pages later, a MONIAC tank labeled clock. If you've got a clock and gates, you're not just moving water, you're computing with it. Meanwhile, an Office No 1C slid a sticky note onto a permit file, heritage concern. That phrase freezes digs and clears lanes. The Oyutalga playbook, documented in 2010's development, taught ministries a trick: rename, reroute, relabel. A digital buffer called legacy voids ringed places big projects didn't want eyes. The van's GPS pings brushed that ghost fence. The team had no idea. Stakes tightened. If they were right, they were walking toward a buried machine older than bronze. If wrong, they were trespassing for a fine and a dead drone. The van felt smaller with every dune. At a lunch stop, the engineer rolled a clay bead in his palm while the ethnographer showed how her aunt tied it to a reed so a bowl's weight flips a tipper. He smiled. Latch. Memory in mud. Curiosity seed planted. Payoff comes when we build the 2-bit counter. That night, with stars sharp as glass, they ran the radar sled along a dune's flank. 2 meters noise, 4 shadows, 6 bang. A flat, hard return like a board. Somewhere else, a satellite pass lit their van on a screen as a bright pixel in a gray sea. 2 clocks had started, theirs and someone else's. Back at the cafe days later, they built a proof with a pan of sand and a jug. Cut a Y-pack clay. Carve a Tesla-style pocket on one branch and leave the other smooth. Pour. The biased path edit installed at low pressure, then snapped open hard at a higher head, the leaky diode doing its job. Thresholds. 1s and 0s in water. Stack 2 biases and you get an and. Add a drip clock made of reeds and beads, pulses 3 beats apart, and only the meeting pair opens the stubborn pocket. That a gate. They chalked their test with 2 lines and a dot where the pocket bit deepest. Then they flipped through the notebook photos and found that same mark carved at junctions in the hex lattice sketch. The symbol wasn't decorative. It was a label for where choices live and how costly they are. Here's where the ground starts to matter more than the page. 8,000 years ago, during the Holocene Climatic Optimum, this desert wore wetlands and megalakes. Seasonal head. Steady surges. The perfect metronome for a network that counts by thresholds and time. If you know fluidics and you've got cadence, you can move freight, warnings, and ration counts with nothing but wind, water, and stone. One more thing was happening off-stage. Heritage memos multiplied, drone rules tightened. But the team had a clock, a symbol, and a hard return at 6 meters. They didn't publish. They packed. Cliffhanger beat. The permit note lands right as the radar finds a hard plane. 2 clocks start ticking. East into the girdle the notebook promised, toward shafts that shouldn't exist, and a first lie waiting on the rim. The first shaft, the first lie. 3 days later, a herder's mare punched through a crust of earth and the dune sighed like a bellows. We reached the spot at dawn. The slump wasn't ragged, the edge curled into a clean oval. Sand slid away to show a throat of dressed stone with tight joints and a proud collar lip, the kind you see in city wells, not the middle of nowhere. The engineer ran a gloved hand along the rim and whispered, finished by hand. This wasn't a sinkhole, it was an entrance. Stakes hit hard. If modern, our theory died. If ancient, we were standing on the lid of a machine. We dropped a weighted tape, 6 meters, a heavy thunk on a capstone. Cool, mineral air rose with a faint sweetness, the smell of deep water. The ethnographer turned, bracelets clicking, and aligned her compass to the solstice line. She traced it toward the rising sun and pointed south. Resistivity lit a seam like a buried river, not a tomb, a route. We worked fast. LiDAR took a slow sweep. Then a tethered drone slipped down the throat. The walls weren't rough, they were true-faced and skimmed with a milk-white mortar on slate-dark stone. The bottom wasn't mud. It was a capstone over a void with a notch cut like a keyway, planned access. The engineer swore softly, not chance, intent. A white SUV idled on the ridge. A gray-jacketed official strolled down like he owned the weather. Cold War bunker, he said before we finished a sentence. Rehearsed. He snapped a photo, made a note, and told us to pack for safety. The word bunker hung there like a blanket over a lamp. But the mortar wouldn't play along. That night in a humming bathroom, we prepped a microscrape from a chipped edge. Later lab work on grains locked deeper told the truth. Calcium silicate lime with silt fines, slow-cured in wet air. The signal anchored around 8 millennia. Not Portland, not 20th century, not a bunker. Back on the sand, ground-penetrating radar told a story tombs never tell. At 6 to 9 meters, returns ran ruler straight, then branched at 60 degrees in a repeating lattice. Tomb's end. This rooted. The geophysicist toggled overlays until a honeycomb flashed under our boots. We stepped back. On the collar stone, half hidden by sand, the twin lines and the dot showed twice, tucked by the throat. The symbol lived at the decision. A herder who'd been bringing milk tea watched our faces and told a story his grandmother loved. After heavy rains, the ground near old wells sang. Low, then high like a reed pipe. You felt it in your ribs. The engineer caught my eye. A clock that moves water can sing when air rides the flow. That's not noise, that's timing. We cut a shallow trench on the lattice line for silt cores. Pollen profiles read like a postcard from a greener world. Artemisia, steppe grasses, then bulrush and pondweed you do not find in today's Gobi. Holocene Climatic Optimum. Seasonal surges, head enough to run a schedule. The question shifted from why water was here to how they timed it. Impact came quick. Equal path lengths across hex legs meant synchronized arrivals. In fluid logic, that's clean timing. In human terms, a system that makes choices. The notch, the lattice, the solstice line to a seam, pieces of a module you can clock. We needed a language that didn't use silicon, so we built it in sand. We shaped a junction in a tray beside the shaft. One branch with a Tesla-style pocket, one smooth, poured at low head. The biased path edited and stalled, bleeding pressure like a leaky diode. We raised the jug, snapped threshold, then closed again at ease. We fed 2 pulse drips 3 beats apart. Only the meeting pair opened the stubborn pocket. And in mud, we chalked the pocket with 2 lines and a dot where the bite lived. Back at the rim, the same dot sat where scars were deepest. The mark wasn't art. It was caused. Meanwhile, that bunker label did its quiet work downtown. A memo reclassified the area as a safety zone. Drones grounded, permits paused. We'd seen the Oyu Tolgoi maneuver, heritage as cover, buffers as corridors. One of our envelopes vanished in transit and reappeared lighter by a gram. A friendly call suggested we submit through community channels. We smiled and kept scanning. Here's where the human side bit. The herder laughed softly, set his palm on the collar, and hummed a low note. The vent slit answered with a faint higher tone, then fell back. The engineer lifted his hand, feeling the push. Pressure ticks. A metronome buried in stone. This was the moment everything changed. The hex wasn't pattern, it was program. The shaft wasn't a hole, it was a port. The lie wasn't clumsy, it was policy. We packed before sunset. The official waved without his eyes. The ethnographer traced the twin lines and dot in dust on the van window and said, "Someone wrote this for us to read." The engineer kept sketching a one-way curve you can carve with a chisel. We didn't argue. We drove toward the next throat, following a lattice that was finally starting to talk back. Liquid Logic 101, buried in sand. What nobody saw at first was how simple the proof needed to be. Not a lab, not a grant. Just a plastic tray, wet sand, a knife, and a jug. If form sides flow, shape can choose yes or no. That's the entire bet. So we set it up where the wind couldn't hit the surface and carved channels the way a mason's hand would remember. Slow bends, tight throats, no right angles if you can help it. Stakes first so you don't miss why this matters. If a carved junction can give you a threshold, open at high head, stall at low, then the system under these dunes isn't art or drainage. It's logic, which means schedules, policies, and power without a scribe. Freight windows, flood overrides, counts you can trust with your stomach on the line. If one junction proves it, the lattice stops being pretty and becomes code you can run. We cut a Y1 branch, the Tesla trick. Bulbous pocket, narrow return to bleed push if you come from the wrong side. The other branch we left clean. Same inlet, 2 options. We raised the jug shoulder high and poured. The first rush tried both ways, then most of it slipped into the pocket, swirled, bled energy, and stalled. Not blocked, just tired. We lifted the jug higher, snapped through, dropped the head close. That's a threshold. A leaky diode turned into a gate by pressure alone. Action beats stack quick once you see it. We added a reed drip clock, 2 reeds pinched with clay beads, each releasing a pulse every 7 seconds but offset by 3. When the pulses met at the junction, the biased path opened. When they arrived alone, they died in the pocket. And with water. The engineer grinned like a kid who just found a hidden door and said 2 in series and you've got a clean latch. We tested that 2 by hanging a bark flap on a twig, so the first success tipped the next choice. Memory in mud. We wanted timing proof you could measure. So we used dye, red for freight, blue for warning, and ran a cadence off a little siphon oscillator like a pocket MONIAC clock. 10-second chops became steps the junction could hear. The biased path opened on the second high head, ignored the first, and then reset. We logged the arrivals against a scratch table, 4s and 8s like a child's counting song. The land was counting with us. Meanwhile, the twin lines and dots stopped being a rumor. We chalked our tray like a collar stone, 2 lines for walls, a dot where the pocket bit deepest. Then we checked the notebook photos again. The dots were always at the throats, but they weren't centered. They hugged the stubborn wall. Left dot, left branch needs a shove. Right dot, right branch, not art. A cost marker, a promise about effort. We scaled up 1 notch. 3 gates in line, left biased, right biased, clean merge, bottle clock thumping and even ticks. Red die goes first. Blue follows 3 beats later. If red lands inside a 2-beat window, the merge throws it left, miss the window, and it goes right. We raised the header by 2 fingers and watched the decision flip. No levers, no strings, just pressure and shape. Program by head. Here's where you anchor it so you don't feel like you're floating in a story. Nikola Tesla's 1920 patent built this bias into stone, valvular conduits that let flow pass one way clean and punish it the other way without a hinge to fail. The MONIAC in 1949 turned head into policy, tanks and orifices making taxes and spending feel like water. We weren't copying those machines. We were using the same physics. If carve enough pockets, thresholds happen. Stack thresholds, logic happens. Feed logic a beat, programs happen. Human beats give it teeth. The ethnographer pulled a clay bead with a notch, the ant's reed tipper, tied it to our bark leaf and set a tiny memory that flipped every second pulse. A steward doesn't need a chart when their fingers already know where the weight tips. We added a second leaf and made a 2-bit counter in sand. Every fourth pulse, the gutter burped blue. We wiped it clean, ran it again, and it burped on the same beat. Impact came in a rush. Equal path length legs on a hex aren't pretty, they fight skew. If every branch takes the same time, the windows line up over distance. That's how you send a warning that outruns a flood or hold freight on odd beats and release on even basin after basin without a single scribe or bell. The wind is your fast clock. The aquifer is your slow one. Together, they gate the day. We stress-tested the doubt. We plugged the reed notch with wax, no enable, then poured. The bias still existed, but the window vanished. Red smeared, blue lost priority, the lat forgot. Unplug the notch, tick returns. The same pocket that looked like ritual curve snapped back to instruction. The stone wanted to compute, it just needed breath. One more detail nobody expects until they hear it. Drive a chain of pockets with ragged gusts and the first gate stutters. 2 gates later, the pulses even out. The pockets shave peaks, fill troughs, and turn noise into ticks. Debouncing in rock lungs. That's how a singing ground becomes a metronome. So we packed the tray, rinsed the dye, and stared east. If a puddle can do this, a lattice can do it across miles. Gates are choices, notches are rules, dots are costs. Give it a beat and the desert speaks. And if the model holds, somewhere out there is a room where the whole sentence is carved end to end. We started walking. The girdle of wells, a network, not ruins. While we were drying the tray and packing the dye, the map on the laptop started whispering another story. Those wells we'd pinned weren't scattered, they curved into clean loops. Not random at all, rings repeating like beads on a string. We pushed the drone out at first light, flying goat height to stay boring, camera tight to ground. The sand broke in regular arcs, throat stone, then another, spacing so even the engineer started counting under his breath. Every 6th collar was larger, a checkpoint in stone. Look, I'm gonna tell you something that sounds insane, but the stakes jump. A chain of wells could be storage. Loops with equal legs, that's timing. Equal path lengths give synchronized arrivals. When arrivals sync, you can schedule. And when you can schedule, you can program. The city idea shrank. We were staring at a fabric, routing, not ruins. Withhold the master clock 1 scene longer to spike watch time. We walked the arc with a tape until the sun cooked our necks, then cut across to the next loop. The underground hex we'd seen on radar surfaced here as a girdle skirting a shallow basin, miles long. At each throat, salt had grown into a delicate lace, the kind you only get when mineral-rich water jets, pauses, and dries, layer by layer. The engineer scraped a flake, flipped it, and showed ribbing on the underside, impact ridges, switch crusts. That wasn't a poetic name. It was where from repeated wet-dry at the same strike point. Human angle, right? A herder waved us to a low swale, then went quiet. We waited. A faint tone rose like blowing across a glass bottle, low, then a quick step higher, then back down, singing ground. He grinned. We felt it in our ribs. Vents tucked by throats held reed clusters, and the wind turned those slits into whistles. Not art, instrumentation, a metronome you can hear. Meanwhile, the drone's thermal feed showed lines colder than the sand thread between throats. Shallow subsurface flow still moving, even in the dry. We followed 3 loops that linked like chainmail and fed a trunk line angling toward an escarpment stitched with wind towers. 2 more trunks aimed at ghost wetlands from old satellite passes, pale stains where basins used to breathe. We needed scale you could argue with, so we flagged an entire loop and ran a timing test. Noon. A pour of bright dye slipped down the first throat and vanished. 10 minutes later, a faint smear surfaced at the second throat. 18 at the third. 28 at the fourth. Variations in head didn't break the cadence. Total loop time held tight. Those Tesla-style pockets were carved in stone to bleed hot surges and bolster the lows, stabilizing the beat. Stabilizers weren't theory. They were mineral scars and minutes on a watch. We modeled the loop like a pocket MONIAC chain. Vary the head with a greener sky, the Holocene Climatic Optimum, and the period locks. Our intervals matched paleohydrology estimates for wetter Gobi surges. The crust carried the rhythm like ticks on a drum. Impact landed on the map. The trunks didn't fade, they targeted basins, a salt pan locals avoid, a tamarisk-choked ravine, and a saddle crowned with wind towers. If gates are choices, clocks run them and the wind gives ticks while the aquifer sets the slow drum. We flagged a trunk at 50-pace marks and just listened. Hiss pause, not a stream, a packet cadence. We dropped a crumb of dye in the feeder and jogged the flags. Every third hiss carried color. Packets, not flow. Information writing pressure. What nobody knew back in that cafe was how neatly this matched engineering papers on equal path-length routing in honeycomb grids, modern design to kill clock skew. The desert had arrived there first, and in stone. Stakes got human again. Petroglyphs at 3 throats showed short tallies next to a cup and line. Rations, head counts, they lined up with trunk addresses like digital labels. Salt preserved flow direction 2 ridged where jets slammed a face. Most throats favored basins, but a few showed reverse scars, back pressure signals. You could send a no upstream by choking a vent and forcing a bypass. That's a routing protocol in rock. This changed the map from pretty holes to a living network. With clocked loops and long-haul trunks, you can count caravans like tokens, throttle freight by windows, and push alerts that outrun floods. But a network needs a master beat to keep distant loops honest. Local ticks we had. The question now was the governor, who set the pace for the whole ring. We hiked the trunk toward the escarpment, the wind hard enough to sand our teeth. The towers stood skinny and offset, throats aimed into prevailing gusts. You felt pressure jump in your ears before you heard it, a soft throb, then a sigh, then another throb. The engineer pressed a palm to a slit and smiled, pressure ticks. We tucked a ribbon into a carved duct. It fluttered, paused, fluttered, locked to the tone. Air driving water, water pushing air. Oscillation, translation, wind into hydraulic ticks. We built a quick and dirty proof at camp. Jerrycan header, 2 bottle accumulators, a loop with an asymmetric pocket on the water side, a fan and pinhole plenum for air. 3 thresholds downstream, easy, medium, stubborn. The pulse marched, advance, hold, advance, perfectly synced to air ticks. Low wind opened the easy gate. More wind woke the medium. The high harmonic blinked the stubborn on every 4th tick. That wasn't vibe, that was program. And here's the kicker. At a throat with a tiny side notch linking reed slit to channel, blue warning die only moved on the high note while red freight advanced on alternate lows. The notch was a wind enable, priority interrupt baked in. Once you hear that split with your own ears, the girdle stops being a ruin. The desert's metronome. The desert was already running code. The wind towers looked thin and harmless from a distance, but up close they felt alive. The stone throats were offset on purpose, facing into the prevailing gusts like instruments waiting for breath. Before we heard them, we felt them, little pressure thumps in the ear, then a low note, then a higher one that seemed to ride the back of a gust. The herder called them speakers. He wasn't wrong. They weren't shrines, they were translators. Stakes verticalized. A master clock means rules you can't ignore and consequences if you try. Look, I'm gonna tell you something plain. If you can turn wind into steady hydraulic ticks, you found your master clock. Stakes don't get bigger than that. A clock means programs. Programs mean rules you can enforce without a chief or a scribe. Freight windows you can predict. Flood overrides that trigger themselves. If the towers gave the beat and the loops kept it, the grid wasn't just clever plumbing. It was a machine for living. We tested the tower's throat with a bundle of reeds tied loose. The bundle started to sing on a low tone that rose whenever a gust hit, then settled back. Below the slit, a carved duct disappeared into the hillside. We stuffed a ribbon into the mouth of the duct, and it fluttered in step with the tower's note. Pause, flick, pause, clean rhythm. Air pushed water. Water shoved air. The pressure oscillation walked down the channel as little nudges. That's your tick. We built a bench rig to make sure we weren't being romantic. Viral trigger, proof you can copy at home. Jerrycan bottles fan, so the mystery becomes repeatable awe. Jerrycan as a header tank, 2 bottle accumulators, a loop with an asymmetric pocket we deheat formed to mimic a Tesla-style bias. On the air side, a fan fed a small plenum with a pinhole bleed. Downstream, 3 thresholds, easy, medium, stubborn. We pulsed the fan. The die advanced in chops, not a smear. Advance, hold, advance, locked to each air tick. Low wind, only the easy gate blinked. Turn it up, the medium joined, then the stubborn opened every 4th tick when the reed hit a higher harmonic. We were clocking water with wind. No valves, no levers, just pressure and shape. Here, S where it gets crazy, but it's also where it gets simple. Those bias pockets do more than choose, they groom the signal. We killed the steady fan and pulsed the plenum by hand in this sloppy, uneven way. The first gate stumbled. By the 3rd gate, the pulses were marching even. The pockets shaved the peaks and filled the troughs. Devons in stone lungs. The towers didn't need perfect wind. The network fixed the noise on its own. We needed anchors, not just vibes, so we timed the reed harmonics against lip heights we'd measured at collars. Fact check anchor. 2nd harmonic approximately 2-finger enables. 3rd approximately 3-finger, matches field lips and lab plots. The 2nd harmonic lined up with enable notches cut 2 finger widths above lip. The stubborn 3rd showed up where the notch sat 3 finger widths high. Then we compared that to the MONIAC idea, accumulators smoothing head into cycles, and our rig's sawtooth traced the same steps we saw etched as grouped 4s and 8s on collar stones. Physics met chisel marks and shook hands. We ran field programs with dye to see if priorities were real or a story we liked too much. Red freight moved on alternate lows. Blue warning only rode the high ticks. At a throat with a tiny slit linking reed to channel, the blue burst punched a bypass we'd flagged but couldn't parse. Open on high, closed on low. Priority interrupt. The notch wasn't pretty, it was precise. The human piece snapped this into place. The herder's grandmother pulled a little bone whistle from her coat, a reed with 2 notches. She braced it across the vent and blew. When the note jumped, our stubborn gate in the rig blinked in sympathy. When it dropped, it went quiet. Her ear had known the threshold since she was a kid. You don't need numbers when your breath is the ruler. Meanwhile, back under the dunes, the geometry answered a nagging question. Why did the grid favor hex legs? Equal path lengths kill skew. If the master ticks leave the tower ragged, the chain of bias pockets cleans them. If the distance tries to smear the cadence, the honeycomb keeps all roads the same length. The clock doesn't just beat, it arrives together. We pushed the model 1 notch further with nested clocks. The wind is fast, the aquifer is slow. 2 accumulators fed our hub rig. On low wind and middling head, red walked every other tick, blue stayed home. Raise only the wind, blue primed flood paths but didn't steal the day. Raise only the head, red widened its windows. Raise both, the hub's cross mark diverted everything to safety. That wasn't faith. That was a state change you could feel in the hose. What nobody knew at the time was how forgiving this system really was. We choked the plenum, nicked the pocket, even shifted the notch height by half a thumb. The program bent, but it didn't break. Freight slowed. Warnings still punched through on highs. The metronome wasn't brittle, it was resilient. Impact in one line. The towers gave the beat, the pockets groomed it, the hex kept it honest, and the collars enforced the rules. The desert had a pulse, and the network turned it into policy. Standing there with the wind in our teeth, it hit me. We weren't listening to ruins sing. We were eavesdropping on an old machine that still remembered its song.